So, und dann wünsche ich Ihnen allen einen wunderschönen guten Morgen.
Right, a very good morning to all of you. I hope you had a great day yesterday, and I hope that you enjoyed the workshops.
Und Sie hören es auch, es wird schon simultan übersetzt.
And as you can hear, we already have simultaneous interpretation with us.
Dazu gleich mehr. Ja,
I will talk more about that in a minute. So, welcome to the second day of our conference, Power and Gender. My name is Anne Chebu. I will be your moderator today, and I'm happy to see all of you here. Kai Kabs-Ballbach is here with me. So, Kai Kabs-Ballbach, board member of the BAG Jungenarbeit, Jungen Boys with an asterisk. So what were your impressions of yesterday, and what were the workshops like? Well, first of all, a very good morning from my part as well. As Anne Chebu said, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the board members and MeinTestgelände as the co-organizers. And I see Raewyn Connell is there already. This is wonderful. Great to see you. Good morning. So that's great news. We have you online with us. But let's take a short moment to look at the workshops that we had yesterday. We had 6 excellent workshops. And well, unfortunately, we had to limit the workshops to 20 participants so that, well, we could still actually work together. That was a bit unfortunate, but it was necessary. Anne Chebu, you would just interrupt me if I go too long, because otherwise I will just talk about the workshops a little bit. Number 1, Macht Mädchen Politik, Power Girls Politics. Even in times of Corona, it is important to keep the projects going. And I think that the reform of the 8th book of the Social Code made this even more important, and also gave some possibilities in this respect. What else? Well, the demands of the workshop were no savings in post-corona periods, raising awareness, supporting political structures. So these are very important demands that came out of this workshop on girls and politics. Claudia and Michael hosted a workshop on the part of MeinTestgelände. MeinTestgelände is a forum for young people, for youngsters, offered by them, for them. It's not organized by adults. These are young people, a safe space, an online portal that enables young people to experience recognition, to empower themselves, to experience agency, and to experience effectiveness as well. Workshop 3, Crip Meets Queer. I participated in this workshop, so I can tell you from my own experience. A lot of people said they want to participate in this workshop. So there was a great interest in gender diversity when it comes to persons with disability. This really brought out the intersectional dimension of our conference. Human sexuality, when it comes to people who require assistance, people with learning disabilities, people with cognitive impairments or other disabilities. they often lack visibility. So it's important to raise awareness, to open up spaces, to point out discriminating structures, and also to make an offer to young people, to young adults. And the two speakers really made the point that we shouldn't tell the story of disability as such a tragic thing, but to really offer something affirmative and something positive. Workshop number 4, caring boys, ? Young masculinities. There were two interesting strands of the discussion. Number 1 was the question, where does the image of the caring male, the caring man or boy come from? Is this a thing of taking charge? So is this something that goes back to old notions of masculinities as men or males taking charge of care or care work as well? Or do we experience a paradigm shift? Are these men or boys who say we want to take on responsibilities for children? And plus, there is an element of caring even in old and traditional masculinities as well, and it's important not to forget that. There's a DFG project on this issue, sponsored by the German Society for Research Promotion, and yeah, that was a workshop on caring boys. Then the Federal Association Trans, we invited Mary Günther to give a presentation on the needs of gender non-conforming and trans children and young people. This is about training and educating people working in youth work, raising awareness of the complexity of the issue of trans, quite similar to Crip Meets Queer. Because this is something that's often forgotten or overlooked, and it's important to raise awareness that this is an issue and that structures have to be opened up. Then, last but not least, Magda Isaac, Empowerment Black Feminism. This is about education work from an intersectional perspective and criticizing discriminating structures. The most important sentence was, everybody is responsible to bring about structural change for non-white girls' work. And I think this is something that we need to be aware of as well. Taking diversity into account, representing diversity, and filling the concept of diversity with life, really. Well, so much for the workshops. We then had presentations in the plenary session. I think most of you attended these. And it became very clear that even if we put the category of gender at the center, there are many other categories that need to be taken into account. Gender alone will not be able to represent or describe intersectional dynamics, structural, social imbalances. Racism is an important issue that needs to be addressed, also in the combination with gender, but classism as well. Poverty relationships, what does this have to do with gender, and how do these factors compound each other? So this really was an important and insightful day yesterday. Yeah, thank you very much. And I can only agree with this. I also thought it was absolutely exciting, and we will continue in this vein. We have an exciting guest, Raewyn Connell, live from Australia. Good morning, or rather, good evening.
Okay, good. And I'm glad to be connected.
It's good to have you here. We're really happy to have you here as our guest. Yeah.
Das Spannende vielleicht auch nochmal, wir liegen ja genau 8 Stunden auseinander.
We're actually exactly 8 hours apart, and it's quite interesting an interesting process to find a date. We were very happy that she said yes spontaneously. We addressed her, approached her about the topic, and she said yes spontaneously. But something that was actually quite difficult was to bridge the time lag between Central Europe and Sydney, Australia. We did manage So Raewyn Connell is here live from Australia. This is wonderful. And even at the test meeting, she said, it's magic to see each other in real time. And that's exactly what it is. It really is fantastic that this works. Yeah. And now something else that's fantastic is that we have simultaneous interpretation. So those of you who would like to listen to Raewyn's presentation in German can select the German channel. In this Zoom meeting, you will find a menu bar at the bottom. There is a globe symbol. If you click on this, you can select the language that you wish to hear. You could also switch off the interpreters altogether and just listen to the original, or you click on German if you want to listen to German, or English if you then want to listen to the English translation of the German questions that will be asked later during the meeting, during the discussion. Our interpreters are Astrid, Junius, and Bianca Walther, and we are very happy to have all of you here. I will now hand over the floor, or hand the floor back to you, Kai Kabs-Ballbach. Well, I don't think I have much to add. Maybe 2 or 3 sentences on who Raewyn Connell is. It's something absolutely special to have Raewyn Connell here for a presentation, or a talk, as she put it herself. So it's great to have her here as a contributor. Why Raewyn Connell? When we prepared the meeting, in our working group, we thought, well, if we talk about gender and power, we really want to put this topic in the focus and to have a high-profile speaker. So we thought about it, and we thought, well, if it is at all possible, we would love to have Raewyn Connell there. And we will just ask her if she could give us a presentation, a lecture on gender and power. One of her early books she wrote was on gender and power. So was Masculinities, with the concept of hegemonic masculinity. This is something that has really been seminal, a seminal contribution to the social sciences, to gender and gender sociology. Raewyn Connell still gives a lot of lectures and publishes a lot. For example, she contributed to a Latin American volume, and again, wrote something on masculinities, but she also publishes on trans issues. Today, I think we will take an international perspective. I think it's a good thing also to look beyond our national borders, what's going on in other parts of the world. So, and we already heard that we will hear something about other countries as well. So I'm very happy that we can start now. I don't want to take much more time. Raewyn Connell, we are ready when you are. So we'd be very happy. We would pass over the floor to you. Thank you.
Okay. I have to engage now in a technical exercise of attempting to share my screen and start my PowerPoint presentation. So here we go. And here is the PowerPoint. Achtung, Geschlecht. I attempt to share, and theoretically, that should bring up my first slide. And I will now even attempt to share the script to go full screen. This is a major technological accomplishment for me. There we are. Is that right? Excellent. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to be here. This is a topic very dear to my heart. I want to start by saying greetings from Australia. Here is a picture of Australia, a photo I took myself in a nearby part of the Australian bush, not more than 10 kilometers, I think, from where I was born, and in the northern area of Sydney. And I do that just to show that I really do come from a long way away, but I'm intensely interested in the kinds of issues you are discussing, and I have learned so much from colleagues in Central Europe over the years. I'm very glad to be able to give something back. I think you are speaking of an extremely important theme, one that matters in people's personal lives, because gender and power relations in gender do affect the way people understand their own lives, how they construct themselves. Gender matters in human relationships, families, peer groups, friendships, and more. And it matters at the macro level too, at the level of governments, economy, institutional life, education. In all of these areas, the issues that you are discussing at this event do matter a lot. Now, when we focus on power, if we look at the pinnacles of power in the world that we live in, it is quite striking how strongly gendered the elite levels of power are. For instance, in economic power, the people who run the transnational corporations, which are the most important, most powerful institutions in the global economy, are overwhelmingly men. In fact, about 95% of the top managers of large transnational corporations are men. If we look at military power, at the armed forces of the world, the concentration of men at the top is even greater. It's something like 99% of the generals in the world are men. If we look at personal fortunes, the hyper-rich oligarchs, the billionaires, again, we're mostly looking at men. If we look at the elite levels of political power, well, here's an example. Here's the group who hold supreme political power in China. This is the central executive of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, the ruling party there. And you can count the number of women who are there. And then if we think of religious organizations, most of the organized religions of the world are basically run by men too. So there is this very significant gendering of elite levels of power. And this is something we're familiar with in most periods of history, going back certainly for thousands of years. And yet this does change even at these levels. And you will be familiar with that in Germany, of course, because of the very significant political power held by Angela Merkel in very recent history. And in Australia, we likewise have had one woman as head of government in recent years, the first in the whole history of settler colonial government in Australia. So although gender patterns are very strongly marked in contexts like this, there is still the possibility of change. And that is an issue that I want to run through all my remarks and come back to right at the end. What I'm planning to talk about in turn is, first of all, how we learn gender and how we encounter power in gender relations. Then I want to go theoretical, if you don't mind that, and reflect on how we understand gender and power in gender. And finally, I want to say some things about youth and change in gender relations. So that's the line of march that I propose to follow. So let me start with how we learn gender and how we encounter power, because they are very closely connected. Children begin to learn gender very early in life, and they learn gender because the people around them in their immediate, usually family contexts, are acting in gendered ways. They are, in the words of sociologists, doing gender from very early in life. Here's one of my favorite images of family life. It is, in fact, a fantasy from the 1950s, an illustration in a very popular women's magazine, Australian women's magazine of the 1950s, showing what was presumed to be a kind of archetypal family scene. Well, we know that this is a fantasy. If you look at the cook in this picture, you will discover that she puts on her pearl earrings to do the cooking, that she cooks in high heels. The family, of course, is, and the people in it are stereotypes in various ways, but they illustrate, nevertheless, a way people think about families, and families very characteristically are thought about in terms of gender division, of the place of the father, the place of the mother, the place of the son versus the place of the daughter, and so on and so forth. So that when children begin to ask, well, where do I belong in the world? One of the earliest answers they can give is where they belong in terms of gender, in terms of gender relations. On the right-hand side of this picture, on the left-hand side of this picture, or in the case of some children, of course, maybe not belonging very well in that picture at all. But it's not just at the level of fantasy that children encounter fantasy and imagination, that children encounter families and the power relations in family. Whenever there is family violence, of course, that is a strongly gendered process. And children learn their place, or the place of people in a gendered world, also through that experience. They learn to recognize forms of affection that are appropriate to women or to men, forms of speech, perhaps, and so on and so forth. So in growing up in family contexts, whether or not they are as stereotyped as this way, will almost always be a way that children encounter gender and begin to encounter power relations in the context of gender. Well, from the family, the normal progression is that children will proceed to schools and spend their time learning and playing in schools in some ways a wider social context than the family. But the schools too are gendered institutions, as I discovered very powerfully early in my research career, when I was involved in research in secondary schools, high schools in Australia, both in ruling class schools and working class schools. a point which is captured nicely in the illustration in the artist's work on the cover of the book that we wrote about that study. As children move through school life, spend time in school and interact, they spend a lot of time in peer relationships. They form peer groups, which also are commonly gender structured, not necessarily gender segregated, but highly conscious, according to the ethnographic evidence, highly conscious of the gendered relations. And so a process of learning begins, which is quite markedly collectivized, involves the children's social learning, involves things that children learn together, because learning is often a highly social process, with learning going on in a number of heads at once. And when researchers have looked very closely at this process of learning about gender in school context and peer group context, two things stand out from that research for me. One is the evidence of children's interest in gender matters. I mean, it's not a case that the adult world, has to, oblige children to concern themselves with gender. Children want to know generally, want to understand. They find this aspect of life generally highly interesting. Areas of exploration, sometimes areas of tension and trouble, but very much of concern to most children as they grow up through childhood and adolescence. The other thing that comes strongly out of the research on children's learning in these contexts is the children's agency in these matters. Learning gender is not just a matter of being socialized, of having gender identities stamped on you, like the stamp on a letter or something like that. Children are busy in learning, and this is, of course, a general point about learning. But children are busy, exploratory, intrigued, and active in learning about gender too. They try out gender positions, gendered practices of one kind or another, whether it ranges from upper primary school children experimenting with lipstick, or engaging in gendered forms of sport. Children are active in the matter, not passive. But however active they are, they're still in a structured environment in schools, and there they encounter, often for the first time, what we might call institutionalized power. That is, the hierarchies in institutions like schools, workplaces, and so forth. So they encounter teachers as holders of power. They're likely to encounter school principals as holders of authority, of some more distant kind of power. Power, in other words, becomes a very common, readily experienced part of the experience of education, of the education system. And so the understanding of gendered power becomes more complex than it might have been just in the context of the family. And of course, there are power relations in peer groups too. There are leaders, there are central people in peer groups, and there are more marginal, there are processes of bullying. I'm sure you're more familiar with this kind of stuff than I am. And then, of course, when the kids leave school and go out into the wider world and the wilder world, whether it's into media context, on to university or directly into the workforce, they're going to encounter gender in more forms again. they will encounter, in fact, from early in childhood, they will encounter mediated gender, representations of gender in mass communications, in entertainment, for instance. Here is a very favorite image from the cover of a collection of French research on masculinities. And you will probably be familiar with the actor involved and the type of stereotype, of course, of gender that Hollywood action movies present to young people. They may, in this context, now encounter real gendered violences, not just imagined violence. They may experience sexual harassment that is, in fact, common in the experience of adolescent girls and some adolescent boys too. And some of them will experience rape directly or here. And we've come to recognize this perhaps more as a result of recent media debates of the publicity of the Me Too movement against sexual harassment. But of course, everyone who's done research on gendered violence will be familiar with the way young people come to know about this side of power. Then when they get into the workforce, young people encounter gender in the form of divisions of labor, but also economic power and economic authority in workplaces. For many young or relatively young people, a key experience on leaving school is, in fact, joblessness, unemployment. And this is not just in countries with advanced capitalist economies. Here is an image of unemployed workers in India lining up for relief payments in this particular context. Structural unemployment is a feature of youth in developing countries. It can be at appalling levels. And even in quite rich countries, it's common for levels of unemployment to be higher among youth than among older people in the workforce. When people get into the workplace, when they actually have a job, of course, they then encounter not just structural power and powerlessness in the form of unemployment, but they encounter direct economic power in the form of bosses, foremen, the controllers of workplaces, and have to find ways of coping with their relative powerlessness in the context of economic organizations. So, I mean, I'm reciting stuff that I'm sure is broadly familiar, but trying to take an overview of that emphasizes how pervasive the experience of gendered power is in different forms as young people grow up. This is an inescapable part of life which they come to in a variety of ways, but which structure their lives and will continue to do, of course, in adulthood, but have to be regarded as a formative part of childhood and adolescence. Okay, I now want to step back a little. Being an academic, I'm concerned with concepts, conceptualization, and theory. So I want to just think a little bit about how we understand gender and how power fits into the model of gender. Because there are models of gender where power is not important. One of those is perhaps the commonest common sense understanding of gender. That is, that gender is simply a natural dichotomy, natural in the very strict sense of being given by nature, given that humans reproduce through through a system of sexual reproduction, like other mammals, like many flowers, and so forth. There is a distinction between a biological role of males in reproduction, a biological role of females or female functions. But this, although it is important to recognize and understand as part of the terrain of gender, has no capacity to account for the kinds of phenomena I've been talking about before. And there's very strong grounds for taking that view. But equally, gender is not simply a free choice of an identity or a cultural position. It's not something that can be simply separated from bodies. And therefore, I'm equally critical of views of gender which locate it exclusively in people's imaginations, identities, self-images, and the like. That too is part of the meaning of gender, but it's far from being the whole, and it's certainly not able to account for the large social patterns that I've been talking about so far. So we need another way of thinking about gender, which recognizes that it is a social structure, but it's a social structure that is embodied, that necessarily engages our bodies, our sexualities, that has a connection with human reproductive sexuality, though it is not simply determined by our biological makeup. And all that distinctiveness of gender as an embodied social structure means that the way bodies work matters in gender practice. Bodies themselves have, to put it technically, have agency in gendered practice, whether it's sexual arousal, whether it's bodily habits, bodily learning, forms of presentation of the body. Bodies matter, but that doesn't mean, and it's really important to understand this, that does not mean that gender is somehow outside of history because it's embodied. In a way, we can understand gender as how sexual bodies enter history, enter a social process in which social relations are constructed and change. And that makes a very complex process. I'm totally critical of views of gender which make it simply a dichotomy, simply a binary. Gender has never been binary. It is much more complex than that. Embodied gender involves the production of multiple forms of masculinity, multiple forms of femininity, and a whole complex of institutions and relationships which organize our embodied lives, our emotions, our personal relationships, and so forth. So that's the background view of gender that I build on in trying to understand the lives of young people. You'll find my account of this in a book I've written called Gender in World Perspective. This is the latest edition of it in English. There is a German edition of a German translation of an earlier edition. And in that I develop a model of gender, social gender, as having several dimensions, one of which is power. I regard power, therefore, as one of the inescapable, inherent dimensions of gender relations, alongside other dimensions, such as the economic dimension of production and consumption, the symbolic dimension of representation, communication, and the dimension of cathexis, of emotional attachment and repulsion and separation. But in my reading of gender, power is inherent in it. It's not something we can wave away or expect to abolish. Power relations will exist, whether they are highly unequal or relatively equal is up to us collectively. But it's something that is, if you like, an inherent part of the world of gender relations. Now, here I want to warn against an oversimplified view of gender and power, which I might myself have almost implied at the beginning of this talk, when I showed you the picture of the businessman and the Chinese politicians. It is easy to think that power, in some way, is inherently present in men's lives and not in women's, but that would be a mistake. Power is not, equivalent to being male, being a man, or nor is it equivalent to masculinity. There are forms of masculinity which are definitely not powerful, which are subordinated or marginalized. Recent research on masculinity has become increasingly interested in forms of masculinity that are constructed by men and youth who deliberately reject power, who attempt to live in more equal, egalitarian ways with the women and girls in their lives, who are in fact attempting to construct a relatively gender equal gender order for the future. And that seems to me a very promising way of thinking, and something that I will come back to a little later. But it is important, I think, to recognize that the familiar structures of power, what second wave feminists began to call patriarchy, patriarchal power, have been under contestation now for half a century. In fact, for longer historically than that, though we tend to think of that contestation as having begun, say, in the 1960s or 70s. And certainly that was a great increase in contestation then. Here's an image from when I was young and terribly optimistic. This is International Women's Year back in the 1970s, in 1975 to be specific. It's the demonstration in marking the first International Women's Year in 1975, the demonstration in Sydney, my hometown. And that launched, or it didn't launch because the women's movement had been running then for 5 or 6 years. But that was a peak of mobilization of women naming on and contesting patriarchy, and that was to a very significant extent a youth movement. So is gay liberation, not entirely a youth movement, but to a very significant extent. And we've seen that phenomenon again in the so-called third wave or fourth wave of feminism, and in the queer movement that has developed and to some extent critiqued the old forms of gay politics. And again, we see a good deal of youth activism, and I'm delighted, of course, to see it. And these movements over the last half century and more have indeed changed the world. There have been very significant shifts in social life, economic life, laws, as a result of these mobilizations. One of the biggest changes in the world, I think, in my lifetime, has been the rise of literacy among women around the world as a result of massive efforts in girls to increase levels of girls' education and run adult literacy programs for women. That's a huge revolutionary change in global culture. We've also seen professions such as law, medicine, open up to a very significant extent to access for women who, not too long before, historically, had been forbidden to enter those kinds of professions. We've seen very significant moves to the recognition of lesbian and gay lives and rights. Australia, not long ago, voted in favour of gay marriage, and it's not the only country which has moved in that direction. So these originally largely youth movements have had a long-term impact, but of course they've not had it easily. And in not it wasn't too long after those movements arrived that some kind of backlash began to appear. And in very recent years, in the last 10 or 15 years particularly, there has been an upsurge in mobilizations against these movements. There's been a mobilization, for instance, in right-wing Catholic circles against the concept of gender itself, which is claimed to be not only against the order of nature, but against divine models or laws about how humans should be. And there has been a rise, as we all know and worry about, a rise in authoritarian populism around the world, illustrated, for instance, by the Putin regime in Russia. This is a picture of Vladimir Putin actually on his way to Australia some years back, passing an honoured guard when he got off the airplane in Indonesia. I could illustrate that political movement in other ways as well. And you will be aware, I'm sure, of the contestation of women's reproductive bodily rights in various countries of Eastern Europe, the backlash against gay rights and trans rights in the United States, which gets a lot of publicity in the last couple of 2 or 3 years. So, there is an active and not always happy politics around changes in gender relations. This is a highly contested field, and I guess it will remain so. So I want to wind up my talk with a little thinking about youth and youth's role in changing gender relations. Okay, people of my age are staggered at the amount of time that many young people spend on digital media and their skills, their astonishing skills that have given rise to the idea of there being digital natives in the way that we older people cannot match and indeed hardly understand. And there's something in that, of course. The new media have been advocated, have been proclaimed as arenas of freedom, and many young people do use them that way. But the digital media also are arenas for the circulation of very reactionary gender stereotypes. The internet is full of highly stereotyped pornography, for instance, as I'm sure everyone is familiar with. And they also, the new media also become mechanisms of surveillance, which is worth remembering when we are thinking about freedom achieved through digital media. But what matters for me here is that this also can become a notable new arena for activism, for contestation of gender hierarchies, for anti-patriarchal mobilizations. And I've already mentioned one of those, one which has got perhaps more online publicity than anything else, the mobilization, the Me Too, hashtag Me Too mobilization against sexual harassment, which had a very significant impact in Australia, I might say, and in other parts of the world. I want to mention too, that was mainly a mobilization of younger women using digital media as a form of activism. But I want to mention also the significance of new forms of activism for men, young men and boys. This is an image of the flyer for a symposium that happened just last year in Africa, most of it online, some of it in person, which was a global meeting of the Men Engage Alliance. I'm sure some of you are involved in this and others will know about it, but for those who don't, this is an international network of local organizations, mostly NGOs, mostly voluntary organizations, a network of about 600 different organizations around the world, in Latin America, North America, South Asia, Europe, East and Southeast Asia, the Pacific area, are all represented in Men Engage. I was actually one of the speakers at that conference. That, I think, although anti-sexist work among men and boys can be very difficult, it is to be very encouraging that so many groups in so many different political and cultural contexts have found it worthwhile to attempt that kind of work. There are more intimate, personal forms of politics too. There are negotiations that go on in everyday life. Attempts, for instance, by couples to create what is sometimes called fair families, gender equal families, sharing childcare, sharing paid work, and the like. This also is a form of activism. It may not be very visible publicly, but it does happen in a significant number of families and is, of course, changing the environment in which numbers of children are growing up and their experience of what gender relations can mean, which they will carry forward into other parts of their lives. It is also interesting to me that recent research on men and masculinities has developed a particular interest in what might be called, what are often called hybrid masculinities. Masculinities that are not simply constructed through an opposition to femininity or on the part of heterosexual men through an opposition to homosexual masculinities, but which are constructed by incorporating, if you like, some features which are socially understood to be characteristic of women's lives or gay men's lives and outlook. That is to say, crafting new and more complex forms of masculinity, which at least offer the possibility of more equal gender relations as these patterns of masculinity spread and become more recognized. So as well as the tough messages, the grim pictures that authoritarian politics may encourage us to adopt, I think there are some reasons for optimism, at least for recognizing possibilities of democratic change and more equality in gender relations for the future. We do have, if you like, some liberated zones that are created by, especially by young people in their own lives or online. These are possible. Gender equality can be realized. It is tough then to move from those kinds of experiences, from equal families or equal peer groups, into the world of institutions and economic inequality, where much gender inequality is based, as I was arguing earlier. And that is a strategic issue that I think young activists for change have to address and will be addressing in the future. But the future is possible. We are not stuck in a timeless, unchanging present. So in moving towards the other world that is possible, we need to think of moving from symbolic politics, from politics simply about representation or claims of human rights, to actual organizing of counter-power. And that's the tough part of the recipe. And that, I guess, is where your work will come in, the work of most of the people who are at this conference, in work with youth, which involves enabling them as active citizens and giving them the tools, or helping them gain the tools to understand a gendered world and take a part in changing it. So I wish you well in that work. I hope what I've been able to say has been of interest and perhaps of use. And I would be very happy to answer your comments and questions. Thank you.
Vielen herzlichen Dank für diesen sehr interessanten Vortrag.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. It was really interesting to listen, and I see we already have a few questions coming in. Our viewers and listeners are most welcome to keep asking their questions in the Q&A inbox. I have a question to get us going. You said that young people actually find comfort in the system of two genders, or this binary gender order. Now, a lot of us who work in social work, a lot of us who work with young people, would like to have some advice. What would you tell us? What would you advise us how could we work with young people in a way that accepts that people feel at home in a binary gender order, and at the same time gives them space for more?
I think that young people often see more than the two categories in their own lives. I mean, one works, always with what is within the bounds of the possible, and that is to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, depends on what young people have seen with their own eyes and heard with their own ears. Now that is likely to include quite a lot of gender variation. Young people are, apart from very young children, young people are likely to have seen different enactments of masculinity and femininity. They've seen women being maternal, they've seen women being disciplinary, they've seen women who are preoccupied with their jobs, perhaps. They've seen men who are disciplinary, other men who are nurturant. They diagnose different styles of gender among their teachers when they go to school. These are things that children do see. They may not have a language for it, and that is, I think, where educators and social workers can play a role in helping to give language or pose questions that call attention to some of the variability and diversity in the actual world that the children live in, and therefore begin the recognition that other things are possible. This doesn't mean getting them to read my textbook or simply telling them what gender is. They will work it out for themselves. Once the possibility becomes clear. And that also can be a collective process. I have an enormous faith in young people's capacities to educate each others. It's one reason why I hate single-sex schools, because it radically reduces the capacity for young people to educate each other about gender, or to do so in a way that opens up, gender learning beyond stereotypes. So, of course, there are circumstances in which it's important for boys to huddle together or girls to be in a particular class together. That's legitimate. But I'm very critical of imposing segregation institutionally as a way of life. Okay.
Vielen Dank. Ich würde jetzt eine Frage stellen. Es kommen
Thank you very much.
von den ZuschauerInnen.
Our viewers and participants keep sending questions. There's actually one question I would like to pick out here, especially when we talk about young men who are marginalized. There's a participant who says that these young men try to be hyper masculine and even might become violent. And perhaps because of their very masculine appearance, they are also categorized in a very highly gendered way. So your opinion, what would you say about marginalized young men with a hyper masculine appearance, and possibly including violence?
Yes, I know the pattern. I have interviewed some men of that description, and my colleague James Messerschmidt in the United States has done some very good research on youth who do, in terms of questions of masculinity, youth whose lives have tipped into actual violence, including sexual violence. And I recognize the problem. Again, I warn against a common tendency, not that I think this is common among youth workers, but it's certainly common among administrators and mass media, to stereotype marginalized young men as, necessarily hyper masculine. Marginalized groups, say, marginalized ethnic groups, African Americans in the United States, Turkish origin, Turkish background youth in Central Europe. They include, the full range of masculinities. There are gay youth in those communities. There are violent, hypermasculine youth. There are a lot of people who are, of young people who are just, trying to get along in the middle of the road. That diversity exists in marginalized communities as well. But the particular problem you've put your finger on is necessary to think about. It's something I once called protest masculinity, borrowing a concept from the psychoanalyst Alfred Adler, who developed the concept of the masculine protest, where in a world where power is masculinized, and we still live in such a world, young boys and young men who experience powerlessness can respond. One understands the psychological response here. One can respond by claiming masculine power for themselves, by exaggerating masculinity and thinking that will yield satisfaction and prestige. And in some cases, of course, it does. In some cases, it's the tough, potentially violent young man who gains prestige in a peer group. We see that often. It's not always the case, but it can be the case. It's not incidental, I think, that football, one of the more, and I'm thinking especially of rugby and gridiron football, that is the more violent codes of football, which recruits very strong young men as players, and where the play consists of bodies clashing against each other and overcoming each other by force. Those codes of football are surrounded, by a mass of sexual abuse, exploitation, rape, and harassment of women. It's a very striking feature of football culture in Australia, I'm sorry to say. So you can see that kind of mechanism, that the claim to power through, in this case, a ritualized form of violence may actually work for some young men. But we also know, and here research on masculinity in sport is really quite significant, the number of men who can actually succeed in becoming rich and famous, or even earn a good living through the embodied performance of professional sport, is that proportion of men is very small. It's a kind of confidence trick. Lots and lots of boys are taught these sports and engage in them as teenagers, but very few of them will actually get through to the professional level, and few of those will actually make serious money. So it's a trap actually for many young men, and it may help. All I can suggest is may help for those realities to become known, perhaps more widely than the mass media really present them.
Warum sagen Sie, das ist eine Falle für junge
Why are
Männer?
you saying it's a trap for young men? There was a follow-up question as well on gender and sports, but you already answered this. Why would you say it's a trap?
Simply because the mediated sport, what we see on television, and what men who go into sports bars will be surrounded by, is actually the labor of a very small group of men with very unusual physiques, produced by years and years and years of training. But that mediated, that image of sport, of masculinized sport, is broadcast to hundreds of millions of the audience, mainly men, but not all, of course, because some women are fans too. But there's a huge disproportion between the number who begin to enter that world as young boys or teenagers, and the ones who will actually benefit from it at the end of the day. I might also say that one thing which is hardly ever seriously acknowledged in the mass media presentation of sport is the long-term consequences of professional sport for men's bodies. And there is research on this. Most professional sportsmen, the ones who do get to the top, who do make a living, spend years, crunching their bodies in one way or another. After they retire and are not earning anything more from that work, they have often a lifetime of injury and damage to their bodies to cope with, a lifetime of pain, often from the multiple injuries that their bodies have sustained. So it is actually, when I say it's a trap, there's almost literally one for, in terms of damage to bodies through entry into that pattern of enactment of masculinity in sport.
Eine Frage ist, ob Männer auch
Another
Sexismus.
question, can men experience sexism?
I would say the answer is yes, but the pattern of it is likely to be different and the consequences are likely to be different too. It is, for instance, possible for men to be raped. And indeed, in prisons, significant numbers are. And that can be a gendered experience. I mean, one of the patterns in prison life is a pattern of dominance and subordination where perhaps an older or more violent or more prestigious man takes the active, penetrative role in sexual relationships, often with a younger, perhaps less experienced and less violent man as the sexual partner. That's a familiar enough experience in prison life and in some other social contexts, for instance, in migrant labour forces, where groups of male manual workers, mine workers, for instance, agricultural workers, are obliged to live together very closely together. Those kinds of relationships also may develop. That's one way that men can experience sexism from other men. It is possible for women to stereotype men. And it is possible, though I think not socially very common, for a woman who has greater power, for instance, as an employer, or because of greater wealth, to behave abusively towards men through some kind of stereotype behavior. That is possible. It's a different pattern, however, from the institutionalized inequalities and cultural, denigration of women that constitute the mainstream pattern of sexism.
Dankeschön. Eine Person schreibt,
Thank you. One participant writes that they would like to organize prevention of sexual violence at their school. Do you have any ideas of how this could be organized? How can this be done at schools?
Yeah. It's not something a form of work I have been directly involved in. And my first piece of advice then would be talk to people who have been involved, because there are such programs. In fact, I might say there are quite a number of such programs in different parts of the world. I've read some very interesting South African research on that matter. Indeed, if you would care to contact me by email through the organizers of the conference, I can give you some references to writing about that issue and put you in touch with some of the researchers. My general feeling about it is that that such programs need to operate in at least two levels. One is by creating an overall school atmosphere or school culture which makes a point of respectful relationships between boys and girls, male and female youth, men and women, which enacts respectful and equal relationships, which doesn't always happen in schools, but that's what a program should try to do, and which involves communities and parents in creating that atmosphere. So it doesn't set the school against parents and communities, but involves them in the joint work of creating an environment that is good for girls and, I would argue, also good for boys. But also it has to work at the more specific level of having serious mechanisms for dealing with actual cases of sexual violence when they occur, and not simply shuffling that off onto other authorities such as the police. Schools have to become involved in specific responses too. And that needs careful thought. It needs appropriate professional engagement, but it can be done.
Hier passt die Frage vielleicht auch ganz gut dazu.
There's another question that fits in nicely. How to deal with religions? One participant writes that religions often keep people trapped in patriarchal structures.
I think this is true. In fact, we might make that claim a bit stronger. Religious organizations can be powerful and central bearers of patriarchal ideologies. And I know actually no mainstream religion of scale which is actively anti-patriarchal, and most of the large religious organizations I know are themselves organized substantively in a patriarchal way. So religious organizations, which I distinguish slightly from religion as experience, are bearers of ideas that may even require people to act in sexist and patriarchal ways. That I think becomes, has obviously become a grave difficulty for feminists who have grown up in the context of religion, may continue to have a religious faith. It may put them sharply at odds with the mainstream religious authorities. And we see that, for instance, in the Catholic Church, where feminists have been unwelcome to the hierarchy, but have continued struggles over many years. We see that in Islam. I read from time to time material put out by an organization called Sisters in Islam, which is a feminist Islamic group who are engaged in contestation about the meaning of the holy texts and their proper interpretation and their proper application to modern life. Yes, that is a serious problem in changing patriarchal relationships and gender inequality on a global scale, and of course in local communities too. And yet religions can also be resources for gender justice. And I was brought up in a Protestant context, a more or less Lutheran context, where the concept of justification by faith was, conceptually fairly central, and where we were directed to read the works of St. Paul. Particularly those of you who come from a Lutheran background will know the significance of that and the importance of Luther's lectures on the Epistle to the Romans in the history of Protestantism. Well, St. Paul happened to write about this subject. I mean, he lived in a patriarchal society and he doubtless reproduced patriarchal relationships, but he also said, in one of the famous epistles, in Jesus Christ, there is neither male nor female. It doesn't matter who you are, what you are. There's neither slave nor master, male nor female. It doesn't matter where you are in the social hierarchy. If you have a relationship with the divine figure, that's what matters. And there are those kinds of resources in other forms of Christianity and in other religions too. So I do not rule out, I'm against most religious organizations, but I'm not against most religions. And I think we can find resources that in fact many people have.
Sie hatten sich vorhin so geäußert, dass Sie dem etwas...
Earlier today, you said that you are a bit skeptical of segregated education in schools. So boys and girls being taught separately. Now there is a question, what repercussions, or what consequences might this have for our work with young people? To have a separate boys' work and girls' work, people having the choice to go to one or the other group.
Interesting question, and one I have not faced in my own work, but I do have a view of it. I would argue against a major institutional separation between youth work with boys and youth work with girls. That is my argument for schools. Segregated schools create a major institutional gap between the education of girls and the education of boys, and I'm strongly critical of that. I think that is an educational mistake, a major educational mistake. In youth work, likewise, I would recommend against creating that kind of gap by your institutional architecture, by your major institutional arrangements. I do think there are situations where it is appropriate for boys and girls to meet separately, to learn separately. For instance, in early adolescence, sexual education, education about menstruation, about the issues around first ejaculation, are probably usually best done in segregated groups because of the way those bodily issues are commonly understood in our society and the difficulty youth of that age may have in handling those issues in a mixed group. But I would not rule out the possibility of that kind of issue too being dealt with perhaps after some separate discussion in a joint forum. That also is a possibility that we may move backwards and forwards between separate groups and joint groups. That I would admit. I mean, I think I have a great deal of confidence in. I think most education is improvised, and I include here, youth work by social workers as well as formal teaching in schools. Most of that is improvised in transactions, in face-to-face situations where judgments are constantly being made about what's the appropriate thing to do, how you'll help this group of kids learn at this point on this material. No one can prescribe that in advance. That's always being a matter of judgment. And that applies to any subject matter, any curriculum area or whatever, not just so, but certainly applies in social and sexual education. And there are some cases, where it will work better separately, but there are other cases where it really matters to share and to discover other points of view. For instance, around the issue of consent, which is becoming quite a big issue in sexual education in Australia at the moment because of various scandals about rape, including a recent case of alleged rape in the National Parliament building. This is now a lively subject of debate. And I think, though some of these things will best be worked out among girls and among boys, it's really important for issues of consent in heterosexual relationships also to become something that boys and girls can talk about between each other, but in mixed groups. Something that peer groups can deal with and form norms about that will provide guidance for young people when they're in situations where abuse might occur.
Sie hatten vorhin auch die Popkultur angesprochen.
You talked about pop culture as well. On the one hand, I see that queer people are more present in popular culture than they used to be. So we have trans pop stars, we have people in popular culture that are queer. There's room for queer people in popular culture. But there's also a question, and you address this as well, that in popular culture, you also have a very strong reproduction of stereotypes. How can we critically address such stereotypes in our conversations with young people without coming across as uncool?
It's good question. Perish the thought that we should be uncool. I think, look, I totally acknowledge that. It's a good thing that our that mass media, especially youth media, is now more gender diverse than ever it was in the past, and that is a good thing. I still think, I would still argue that there is a massive gender stereotyping in especially commercial electronic media. I mean, I look at the advertisements for television or cable programs which pass me on the sides of a bus or a train or a tram around Sydney. And what do I see? I see, heavy-shouldered, scowling he-men who are engaged in violent physical combat. And I see slender, blonde, carefully draped, fragile young women portrayed in rom-coms and dramas. So there's a hell of a lot of that stuff still. And even, I have to say, in media representations of queer and trans people, there's a good deal of stereotyping. Young and pretty in conventional heterosexual, heteronormative ways is the usual story for people who become stars in pop culture, whether queer, trans, or cis. So the struggles of your everyday trans woman who doesn't look very suave or pretty, or the struggles of your everyday queer bloke who struggles to keep a job or to keep on good terms with his family, they're not really mass media material in the same way. How do we deal with that? Drama. Get kids to dramatize all of these issues. Get them, I have great faith in education through drama, provided it's creative work in drama, not just, keep on replaying Shakespeare and Schiller. The kids have, often are wonderful at producing, short dramatic episodes to illustrate problems in their own social life. And often they enjoy doing this, with video. And some of it, may well be worth circulating on video too. If you get them, for instance, think about the gap between what they see on screen and what they see around them in the flesh, that's one, theme that you could do a lot with in terms of of dramatization of the consequences of that kind of gap. That's my, I'm not any kind of expert on pop culture and the rawest amateur, but familiar educational techniques, I think, for stimulating discussions about these kinds of things and for getting kids to produce their own educational materials would be very appropriate.
Jetzt haben wir zwei Fragen, die ich so ein bisschen zusammen.
Now we have two questions that I would like to take together. One is about the coronavirus. There's a comment that especially women bear the brunt of the coronavirus load and charge, because especially in Germany, care work is done by women during lockdown when the daycares or the schools are closed. It's the women who take care of the children. There's even a hashtag, Corona is female. And the second question, what place or position does care work have in masculinity concepts?
Yeah, first of all, coronavirus 19, COVID-19, the disease, you're quite right. There is plenty of evidence that women have more than men have taken up the extra burden of care work resulting from the pandemic. I might say that men's care work also has risen, but women's has risen more. And it was unequal to begin with anyway. So that point is perfectly right. And I think it is estimated that 70% of the medical health workers around the world are women. So the frontline workers in the struggle with the pandemic are women. It's that in that respect, the epidemic has highlighted long-standing gender inequalities, which have not been, and we do not live in a post-gender world, in a post-patriarchal world. And perhaps have helped to make clear the significance of care, to dramatize that in public in a way that is, I think, in the past has been hard to do, simply because of the private character of many settings where care work is done, i.e. in homes. That said, I would argue that it has been more common in public representations of masculinity to show men doing care work, especially in relation to children. It is now more common to see images, for instance, of fathers pushing their children in a pusher or a pram. It is, it is something that some politicians take care to have images of themselves doing care work, especially with their children, available to circulate through the media. I think it is, that is a theme that many of, you remember in my talk, I mentioned the Men Engage International Network. In a number of those organizations in that network, men's care work, particularly as fathers, is actually a major theme. in changing masculinity. Some of those organizations are in fact precisely focused on especially young men's care work as fathers, young men's relationships with children. And that seems to me a very, very promising area to work in, promising theme to emphasize. That has not, I think, been yet translated into the kinds of power structures I was talking about at the beginning of my talk. We don't generally see Mr. Putin or Mr. Xi or Mr. Modi looking after, taking care of their grandchildren and spending time playing with young children, let alone changing the nappies or doing the cooking. We don't yet see that. And that is perhaps a measure of the distance we still have to go before we have ended patriarchy in full.
Oftmals ist ja auch das Problem, dass die Männer vielleicht
Very often, the problem is that men might want to take care of their children or do care work, but as soon as their careers got going, they can't take a break for job reasons. Right, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat. We're getting a lot of questions. I will take one of the questions that came in last, and I'd like to come back to daycares and schools. What advantages and disadvantages does gender neutral or gender open education have? What could this look like? And how would teachers have to be trained and educated? What can teachers do? What can they contribute?
I'm not sure if there's a specific kind of program in your mind with this question. But my view is that we should not attempt to eliminate gender from our speech or, if you like, design a curriculum to be simply gender neutral. My reason for that, well, there are two reasons for that. One is that children and youth experience gender in many ways outside the school curriculum. And if we, if you like, refuse to acknowledge gender in the curriculum, there will be a gap of credibility created, frankly. I think gender has to be dealt with, has to be, I mean, it's there in the curriculum all the time, really. We study literature. All literature is gendered. I mean, it talks about gendered people. It's written mostly by men, and women as writers have a specific place in it. All movie, all film, the history of film is strongly gendered, and so on and so forth. You can't actually have a rich and comprehensive curriculum without dealing with gender. That doesn't mean you have to reproduce gender in it, but you have to deal with it. It has to be part of what children learn about and think about and work out ways to deal with. So what I would see as positive, or what I would think of as a good gender neutrality strategy in childcare and schools, is to refuse to treat the boys and the girls differently. So I'm wholly in favor of, gender neutral, gender common might be a better way to put it. language in addressing kids. I mean, the traditional thing that a teacher said at the start of the day was, "Good morning, boys and girls." Always saying boys first. Well, you don't have to say that. You can simply say, "Good morning, children," and you're inclusive from the start. Okay, that kind of thing, that kind of, you know, common treatment can simply become natural in our speech, and that doesn't deny gender, but it doesn't enforce it, if you like, and that I think is the main argument that I would make. The other point that I would make, and this is a little bit more difficult, is that education, to me, one of the functions of education, not the only one, but one of the functions is to transmit culture between generations. And our historic cultures are strongly gendered. So, you know, if we read Goethe, we read Shakespeare, we read, you know, the Mahayana, we read or enact no plays from Japan. We're dealing with gendered texts. We are engaging with a gendered history. I don't think we should deny that. And I don't think we should deny kids access to that through their education. We don't, once again, we don't need to push it down their throats. We don't need to force gender on them. But having access to the wealth of global cultures is part of what a good curriculum should do. That history is gendered. We therefore, good educators, therefore, will deal with it, you know, in an appropriately reflective and sometimes critical way. I think that's what good educators do anyway. And certainly some of my educators did that kind of thing for me, and I hope that is still possible.
Wir haben jetzt nochmal die Bitte, dass Sie bitte nochmal einordnen sollen.
There was another request in the chat. Could you please talk about boys' work and girls' work a bit more, separate groups for boys and girls? Because there was a comment that, again, there is a binarism in there. Trans persons, intersex youth are excluded again. What would your proposal be?
I haven't thought carefully about this. So what I have to say is rather improvised. I've argued that we should not institutionally segregate boys' work from girls' work, that we should have open the possibility for specific groups and circumstances, but we should also have open and be comfortable in often using combined groups and stimulating dialogue between boys and girls. That suggests to me we might have the same logic for people who don't, for young people who don't easily or even partially fit into either of those kinds of, any of those kinds of groups. You know, I can think of many situations where it would be helpful for intersex young people to be able to talk to other people, other intersex young people, where it would be helpful for young people who have been brought up as boys but who feel themselves as girls or future women to be able to talk to others who have the same similar feelings or the same trajectory. So trans girls might, have common experiences and problems that are worth working on together. Trans boys, likewise. Young people with what are now called queer identities might also have common ground, but there may also be possibilities for dialogue across those groups, and a kind of an architecture of multiple differences emerging and recombining, coming back together, might be a way of thinking about a program that recognized gender diversity, but didn't force it on people. How that could be done in practice, I have no practical experience, so I can't really say. But, some of the youth support groups that I do know of for queer youth and for trans youth would be a place to start, how they might be connected with groups of young people thinking of themselves as straight, or people don't normally think of themselves as cis, but who have not had any kind of trans impulses. Those kinds of connections are also worth thinking about and may become possible in a, if you like, combined boys and girls youth work framework.
Eine Frage ist, ob Sie denken, dass es
There was one question. Do you think that there can be a world without gender? Is a world without gender possible?
It's possible, it's imaginable. I don't necessarily want a world without gender. What I want is a world without gender inequalities. I want a world with gender justice. I can't see anything inherently objectionable in recognizing that sexual reproduction plays a large role in human life, that social forms are related to that aspect of human embodiment, that those connections may ramify in many different areas of life. That's what I take gender to be, and I can't see anything inherently objectionable in that. What is to me objectionable is when those relationships, those patterns become structures of inequality, of hierarchy, of privilege, exclusion, exploitation, and hence our sources of violence and abuse. That's what to me has to end. And we may, if we can find ways to end them, we may have a future that is gendered, but gendered in richer and more, more interesting in multiple ways than the world we're in now. Some science fiction is quite interesting in imagining societies with multiple genders. Science fiction often can be a way of stirring the imagination a little. It's not necessarily a blueprint for anything, but thinking beyond what is given is often a very helpful thing to do.
Und was können wir alle dafür tun, in diese Welt
And
zu
what
kommen?
can we all do in order to bring about this world?
Smash the patriarchy. Contest inequalities everywhere they appear. Join your union. Struggle with the powers of darkness wherever they appear. There's thousands of ways that we can contest inequalities and abuses in our gendered lives. Some of them, you know, small and inconspicuous ways, like changing the way we address a class to create common ground rather than emphasize division. Some of them very big, such as contesting, you know, state control over women's bodies, or economies that are based on the exploitation of women's labor and the segregation of exploited labor for men and for women. There are many levels at which we can do those kinds of things, but I think, you know, we always start with and come back to daily lives and immediate relationships, families, workplaces, leisure, personal relationships. Those are all arenas where we can work towards a world of equality and justice. I sound like St. Paul.
Vielen herzlichen Dank. Das war doch ein schönes Schlusswort.
Thank you so much. Great closing remarks. We have a lot of questions, but I think we can't take them all. You have to come back. Maybe next time in person, not just virtually. This would be a great thing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us, Raewyn Connell. Wonderful that you were here.
I'm glad to be here.
Ja, dem möchte ich mich auch nochmal anschließen. Anne Chebu hat mich zwischendrin.
Yeah, I can only subscribe to what Anne Chebu said. She asked me to ask questions as well, and I just looked at the chat and I saw 30 or 40 questions, and I thought, well, I really don't have to ask a question. Yes, Raewyn, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk on gender and power. And I hope that we didn't keep you for too long. It's 8:30 your time, or 7:30 your time, really. So yeah, I'm slowly getting the hang of the time difference between Germany and Sydney. Right. We will talk later, so we will definitely talk again. And now I would like to wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you very much. Yes, from my part as well, have a good evening. And we see a lot of applause here. Everybody liked it a lot. Thank you very much and have a great evening. Enjoy your evening. Yeah. Right. Thank you very much also to Astrid and Bianca, our interpreters. I switched back and forth between English and German in order to catch some of what you did. Thank you very much. You did a great job. And now I think we will also send our interpreters into their day off. Thank you very much on behalf of BAG, Boys Work and Girls Work, and MeinTestgelände. Thank you very much. Yeah, I can only subscribe to this as well. Thank you to Astrid, Junius, and Bianca Walther for being our interpreters. It worked well, and yeah, it's absolutely great. Thank you very much for your work. Now, we had 2 exciting days, a lot of food for thought. And I already said that during these, the chat was really lively. I tried to answer or to summarize as many questions as possible. And I hope that you are all satisfied with the answers that you received. And now I would like to give Ines Pohlkamp the floor, as well as Mark Melcher, our two co-organizers from the working group, girls and boys, and I would like to give you the possibility to tell us how it went for you. Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Now, first of all, I am deeply impressed, and it was a great conference. Mark, how do you feel about it? Yes, absolutely. I'm exhausted, but also empowered. And I had tears in my eyes, really, when Raewyn Connell started. I am absolutely impressed, and it was great to see her live, to get her update, to get her perspective, all her information, everything that she has to say about gender research. So I'm really absolutely glad. And this global perspective, I thought this global perspective was wonderful. You know, just to go beyond the small world that we're living in our daily lives, to take a broader perspective is great. And you said you have tears in your eyes. So do I. And also, when I listened to the talks yesterday, it was wonderful because our speakers gave us so much information on how we can work with young people. We have to keep working together. We have to keep networking. Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes, and that's exactly what I feel. Precisely what you describe. How can we continue working down this road? How can we continue consolidating what we've learned, but also to identify further fields of work? Because nothing is easy. It's all highly complex. It's all highly diverse. And to keep working on this together, that is our task for the coming years. It's absolutely exciting, and I really look forward to continuing to work together. And yeah, how do we smash patriarchy? I think that this was a wonderful summary. How can we smash the patriarchy? That's what I meant by empowering. Right, then we're coming to the end. We are all really fulfilled. And I think that this answers the question very well. We will send an email to everybody with the newest and most recent information, our contact details, invitations to keep working with us, possibilities to stay in touch. And of course, you also get all of our contact details of all the organizers. You will also find a link to an evaluation form. Please write what you liked, and tell us your suggestion. And we would like to turn this conference into a series. We would like to keep working on an intersectional perspective. We would like this to be really a starting point for our work with boys and girls. So yes, please understand this as an invitation to keep in touch, to network, to work with the BAGs, with MeinTestgelände, and so we also provided you the links and the contact details in the chat. Thank you very much, Anne Chebu. I think I can speak for all of us. It was great to have you with us. Thank you very much, and all of our compliments for being our moderator. You did a great job. Thank you. And also thank you to all of you for the great organization and the wonderful program. Thank you to everybody who listened and watched and discussed with us and asked questions, and also gave us praise on our agenda, on the moderation, etc. It was great. It was great fun. Even though it was only a digital conference, the advantage of it was that we were able to get an eminent speaker from Australia, which probably not have been possible under other circumstances. So at least this was some comfort to us. And this was an advantage of not being able to meet in real life. I would like to thank everybody, and I would like to thank all of those who watched and listened. See you next time, hopefully. And hopefully in real life. Thank you, and bye-bye. The meeting is adjourned, I would say. And I think everybody who still has plans this afternoon can check out now. We hope to see you again soon.